Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really big idea, something that's at the very core of how some of the world's oldest Christian churches see themselves. We're talking about apostolic succession. It's this 2,000-year-old claim to authority, and yeah, we're gonna unpack it.
But, before we get into all the specifics, let's just zoom out for a second. Think about this. How does any ancient institution, whether it's a religion, a government, whatever, prove that it's the real deal, that it has authority over literally centuries? That question, right there, is really at the heart of everything we're looking at today.
So, here's our game plan. We're gonna start by defining what apostolic succession actually is. Then, we'll look at the main objection people have. After that, we'll dive into the answers to those objections, see why it still matters today, and then we'll wrap it all up with a kind of final equation.
Okay, let's jump right in. First things first, to really get a handle on this, we've got to clear up some common misunderstandings and nail down a solid definition of what we're even talking about.
So, what is apostolic succession really? At its core, it's this idea that the ministry Jesus started didn't just stop when the original apostles were gone. Nope. The belief is that this ministry, along with its real spiritual authority, was passed down, person to person, from bishop to bishop, in a totally unbroken chain all the way back to the beginning.
And it's super important to also get what this isn't. We're not just talking about a cool historical family tree, or, just a list of names. The claim is about a real transfer of authority. It's also not the same thing as the Pope's specific succession. That's a related but different idea. The big point here is that this is seen as a divinely commissioned ministry, not just people saying, well, this is how we've always done it.
Okay, so a claim this massive has obviously faced some serious pushback, especially since the Reformation. And the main academic objection, the one that really props up almost all the others, well, it all comes down to the meaning of just two little words in the New Testament. This is what's called the synonymy claim. Basically, the argument goes like this. Back in the early church, the Greek words for bishop, that's episkopos, and presbyter, presbyteros, were used interchangeably. And if they were used interchangeably, the thinking goes, they must have been the exact same job, the same office. The idea is that having a separate, distinct office of bishop was something that only developed way later. And this, right here, is the absolute linchpin of the argument against the whole idea of a threefold ministry from day one.
So that's a pretty big challenge, right? How do the folks who hold to apostolic succession answer this? Let's break down the counterarguments.
All right, the defense kicks off with a really simple but honestly pretty powerful linguistic idea. Just because you could swap two words in some sentences doesn't mean they're perfect synonyms. Interchangeability is not the same thing as synonymy.
And here's a fantastic analogy to make this crystal clear. Think about the words legislator and congressman. Every single congressman is a legislator, right? That's their job. But is every legislator a congressman? Well, no. Senators are legislators too. See how that works? The words can sometimes be interchangeable, but they don't mean the exact same thing. The argument here is that the exact same logic applies to bishop and presbyter in the early church. But wait, what about the fact that a lot of academics agree with the synonymy claim? Well, history is full of examples where academic consensus turned out to be, well, wrong. Just look at something called logical positivism. Back in the 1920s, it started taking over philosophy. By the 50s, it was pretty much the established academic consensus in the English-speaking world. You couldn't argue with it. But by the 70s, the whole thing had collapsed. It's basically defunct now. The point is, just because a lot of smart people agree on something doesn't make it true. The arguments themselves are what matter. And it's not just defenders of the doctrine saying this. Even scholars who don't necessarily hold to apostolic succession have questioned this consensus. There's this great quote from Alistair Stewart's book, Original Bishops, where he calls the synonymy claim one of several scholarly fictions that just get repeated over and over until everyone assumes they're facts. Okay, so if that main linguistic argument is shaky, what about the next claim that flows from it? The idea that the early church only had two orders of ministry at first, just bishops and deacons, and that presbyters were a later addition. Well, the counterargument here is that it wasn't a case of inventing a brand new office. It was more of a consolidation of what was already there. The model goes something like this. Very early on, you had small house churches, and each one had its own bishop and deacon. But as these churches grew, and as persecution forced them to work together, they started to consolidate under a single bishop for a whole city. That bishop then needed help, so he appointed presbyters to assist him with the now much larger flock. So the role was always there, it just became more distinct as the church grew.
And finally, there's this famous text from St. Jerome that gets brought up a lot to argue that bishops and presbyters were the same thing. But this really seems to be a classic case of taking a quote out of context. People often quote the part where Jerome says they're basically the same. But what gets left out is the crucial qualifier he adds. He says they're both superior to deacons, sure, but then he explicitly says, except that bishops can ordain. I mean, that one little phrase completely changes the meaning, doesn't it? So, after digging through all that ancient history and Greek words, you might be asking, why does any of this matter today? Why should we care about church structure from the first century? Well, because this very old idea directly impacts how some of the biggest churches in the world understand their own authority and what holds them together right now. To really get the difference, we need to talk about a pretty modern word, denomination. It's a concept that really came about in the 19th century. It was a way to explain how all these different Protestant churches could be united in their main beliefs, but not united in their organization. But churches that hold to apostolic succession, they see themselves as pre-denominational. They're working from a totally different playbook for what unity even means. So here's what it all boils down to. You've got two completely different ways of looking at ministry. In the apostolic view, ordination is the secret act that actually passes on a real spiritual gift and authority, tracing all the way back to the apostles. But in the classical Protestant view, ordination doesn't do that. A minister is, fundamentally, a member of the congregation who's been elected or chosen for a specific job. But we're not quite done. The argument has one more crucial layer to it. It's a point that frames this whole thing. From this perspective, apostolic succession is absolutely necessary, but it's not enough on its own. And that brings us to the final equation. According to this viewpoint, for a church to be considered a true church, it has to have two things, and you can't skip either one. First, you need the apostolic ministry, that authentic, unbroken physical line of succession. That's necessary. But second, you also need right doctrine, faithfully teaching what the apostles taught. That's also necessary. The idea is one without the other just doesn't work. And so this leaves us with the big question that this whole discussion points to. What is the ultimate way to measure if a church is authentic? Is it its history, its lineage, its physical connection to the past? Or is it all about its doctrine, its adherence to a specific set of beliefs? The proponents of apostolic succession would look at you and say, why do you have to choose? You can't have one without the other. Thanks for watching The Explainer.